If you're a coach, who would you send out for an offensive zone draw? Easy, the players that work best in that zone, the most offensively gifted players. So it stands to reason that players who are given majority D-zone starts are the guys who are defensively responsible, or at the very least, the more defensively responsible guys on their team. But are they effective in still outscoring the enemy despite starting in their own zone? Because some players are given far more than their fair share of D-zone legwork, to the point where you'd start to think that they're just so much more consistent than everyone else at getting the puck up to neutral. More than just being defensively sound though, usually these players are centers, because they're the guys who start the play and can actually get possession literally off the draw. At 5-on-5 in a single season, the very highest defensive zone start percentage player since the stats started being tracked was Paul Gaustad, with 93.1% in 2015-16. Think about that. If a whistle blew and Paul Gaustad hopped over the boards, you could bet good money that he was going to plop himself right in front of Pekka Rinne to win a faceoff. For some context, no defenseman ever has a percentage higher than 77%, Brandon Carlo this year. Coincidentally, Gaustad was also 4th all-time in 88.9% D-zone start percentage in the prior season. But combined in those seasons, he didn't do much else. He scored 6 goals and was a +3 across all strengths. Exactly 3,427 player seasons with over 50 games have graced the NHL since 2014-15, when the stat was first tracked. Only 26 have finished a season with over 80% of starts in the defensive zone, which is such a zone disadvantage you'd think they'd get caved in. Now, while 80% doesn't really sound like a debilitating rate, it is. That's the 98th percentile for defensive zone starts. Heck, if you even start just slightly over half the time, 53.7% the D-zone, you're already in the most defensive third of the NHL percentile-wise. Starting a seemingly average 55% of the time in the offensive zone puts you in the most goal-oriented quarter of the NHL. So any significant deviation above 50 is really significant. Of the top 20, again, of thousands of player seasons, almost half of them are Capitals. Capitals center Nic Dowd appears 3 times, and all of the other Capitals are or were his line mates. Up to 2023, it was Garnet Hathaway and to a lesser extent, Carl Hagelin. This past year, it was Beck Malenstein and Nick Obey-Kubel. Their defensive zone starts were 87.4, 88.9, and 90%. Any of them sniffing the offensive zone to start play was like finding a golden ticket. No 3 players on the same line are so close together this high up on the all-time list. These 3 players were given the most difficult deployments of any line since the stats been tracked. It could not be more crystal clear. This was far and away the premier shutdown deployment line of the NHL this season and at least of the last decade. It's unheard of. And make no mistake, they were a line with a very robust sample size of over 420 minutes together at 5-on-5. There were only 20 forward lines in the entire NHL that played 400 minutes or more together, and they're almost all top-end scoring lines. When it comes to defense, nobody else is in the same universe. So, with all-time difficult deployments, it would be understandable if they got outscored, especially seeing as they're 4th-line players. Well, cumulatively, they were a +4 at 5-on-5. And if you sort those top 20 players by points, look who are all near the top. And look who consistently leads the pack in goal scoring. Nic Dowd. A dozen or so goals isn't fantastic on its face, but it's pretty darn good for the 4th line, and really remarkable for a guy who's more likely to get killed by a vending machine than take an offensive zone draw. Now, if you look at the line's expected goals for percentage, it's 40.17. Not so good. But to a degree, that's to be expected when 90% of the time the puck is dropped, you have to go 160 feet to score, and the enemy has to go 20. Taking into context the whole team's expected goals for percentage, that near 8% difference isn't actually so bad, as you'll see when we look at how other lines did. So what gives with the bottom line outproducing opponents despite their deployments? Well, their on-ice shooting percentage is 11.11, and their on-ice save percentage is 93.85. The latter they can't really help, but the former, that's pretty sparkling for any line, especially a 4th line, which isn't exactly known for being a shooter's summer getaway. Looking at some attributes about how they play, we see some very clear patterns. Obey-Kubel and Malenstein flank Nic Dowd with blazing speed, and Dowd's elite-level shooting percentage ensures that he'll probably finish a play that the other 2 started. We can see this in a lot of their goals this year. Most of them started on the rush, at least half a dozen of them. Here's another goal off the rush. Here's another goal off the rush. This one is a textbook fourth line goal. Everything you'd expect from them.
Vision forward. When the Caps see impressive rookie Connor Bedard and the Blackhawks.
We even see in this game a rare offensive zone draw where they made the Rangers absolutely suffer to get the puck out of their zone, and even then they didn't end up controlling it. Just for fun, let's look at some individual games that this line had. Against the Stars, they started 17 shifts in the defensive zone, a season high. Against the Kings, they had 3 goals for, and easily were the biggest reason the Capitals won.
Bump it out wide, slapper on the way, score!
In the last week of the regular season alone, when the Capitals were scratching and clawing for the final playoff spot, they nearly scored, but they didn't get scored on, so they stayed even, and they started no shifts of 15 in the offensive zone. In games 79, 80, and 81, they never had an expected goals for percentage below about 70, despite starting in the offensive zone 3 times across those 3 games. In the final half week of the regular season, Nic Dowd scored a badly needed insurance marker to keep them alive in the playoff race. The next game against the Bruins, last game at home of the season, with the Capitals' typically paltry offense only garnering 1 goal that game, Nic Dowd with the goalie pulled pressured Brad Marchand all the way to the bank, pickpocketing him and sealing the game. In the final game of the regular season, a must-win for the Capitals to get into the playoffs, they started no shifts again in the O-zone and 10 in the defensive zone. And yet they had the highest expected goals for percentage of any line, a Jericho collapsing 79.9%. They played an absolutely pivotal role in the Capitals making the playoffs. And maybe they were a large reason why a team that on the whole didn't really deserve to make it did. Obviously, the Capitals' fourth line isn't the only highly defensive line this season, but when you look at how similar lines fared, their ability becomes that much more noticeable. I compiled what I believe were the top 10 defensively deployed lines in the NHL this past season, with over 65 or 75% defensive zone starts, with 200 or more minutes together. Why 200? That seems low. Well, again, it's because so rarely does any combination of skaters play that frequently in the defensive zone together. Often the lines aren't consistent enough to rack up that ice time as a 3-man unit, which speaks to both the staying power of the Caps' fourth line and their consistency. But even then, as you can see, most of the time these lines were just 2 skaters who were paired together alongside a revolving door at wing. Almost across the board, these lines, which again aren't even really true lines, either had worse play relative to their team average, an inability to actually score, or just straight up fewer defensive zone draws. Remember, none of these lines started in the D-zone more frequently than Malenstein, Aube-Kubel, and Dowd. Of these 10 defensive lines, heck, out of all lines in the NHL, there are only 2 other true blue lines that had significant defensive deployments and responsibilities in the NHL. The first, Sam Steele, Radek Faksa, and Craig Smith of the Dallas Stars. They didn't drastically outscore their opponents, but at least they controlled play really well considering their deployment. But again, they're starting in the offensive zone almost 4 times as often as the Dowd line. The other, Mason Appleton, Adam Lowry, and Nino Niederreiter. With a gargantuan near 700 minutes together, they drove play even more masterfully, and only didn't swamp their opponents in goal due to a lame 6.65 shooting percentage. However, they still are getting much more favorable starts compared to the subjects of this video. They still did better than most of the average defensively deployed lines in every category. Bringing it back to Paul Gaustad for comparison, his line of wingers Mika Salamaki and or Austin Watson had about 93% of zone starts in the D-zone that year. 5-on-5, they got outscored 16-6. If you include Eric Nystrom in that rotation, 27-16. They were defensively relied upon, but they weren't effective. Dowd, Malenstein, and Aube-Kubel were. And over the course of the last 6 years or so, nobody at all who's consistently made the NHL has been placed in that situation more than Nic Dowd by a mile. And if we just focus on him again, he easily leads the group in production, and that's no coinkydink. Obviously, as a solid fourth liner, he only gets like 10 to 13 minutes a night, so instead of point and goal totals, let's look at his rates. This season, Dowd's points per 60 minutes and goals per 60 minutes at 5-on-5 were 1.44 and 0.83. That's more frequent offense than Anthony Cirelli, Ryan Strome, Anton Lundell, and just below Jonathan Huberdeau. None of them started in the defensive zone more than 57% of the time. Dowd did it 90% of the time. His goals per 60 were better than Matthew Tkachuk, John Tavares, Cole Caulfield, and Seth Jarvis. Those four had deployments with privilege equal to that of a senator's son. Now, the obvious counterargument here is that Dowd's ice time sample is a fair bit smaller, but even if you don't think that that's completely undone by how far up the ice he had to go on average to score, let's expand the sample size to 3 seasons. No excuses now. His goals and points per 60 are better. 1.63 points per 60 is about the same rate as Andrew Kopp, Yevgeny Kuznetsov, Anders Lee, and actual Selke winner Jordan Staal. His goals per 60 rate is even more impressive, 0.88. That's better than Tyler Toffoli, Patrick Kane, Bo Horvat, and Michael Bunting over the last 3 seasons, all while being born over the boards into the hockey equivalent of poverty. As if there wasn't enough perspective here, since 2021, Nic Dowd has had almost as many D-zone shifts as Alex Ovechkin has had O-zone shifts. His defensive efficacy is why, in the last 6 years, Alex Ovechkin usually goes 20 feet to score over 150 goals, yet can be minus 42, but Nic Dowd can only concede 20 to get scored on and be plus 39. So in my mind, Nic Dowd is the most responsible, effective defensive forward in recent NHL memory. As for the best defensive forward, well, that has an obvious emphasis on skill, and in the public discourse, perhaps too much so best and not as much defensive. And if Nic Dowd is going up against the likes of Alexander Barkov, Jordan Staal, or Austin Matthews, there's going to be a pretty big gap in talent. Or is there?
To the front block, rebounds loose. Dowd, score! Nic Dowd!
Nation's capital. Kuznetsov, it's batted in! Knocked out of the air and into the net.
Slump to the front where Grizzly got it. Turnaround shot, score!
One-on-one with Mrazek. He scores!
Nic Dowd scores!
No resistance.
Loops it, but right to a waiting Dowd. Throwing it ahead, Stevenson with a good speed. Stevenson's in! He scores! Seam pass picked by Dowd, trying to spring Hagelin for a breakaway. He's in alone, fires, he scores!
Moves in across the line, gets a little room, steps around Sanheim, and ricochets in, they score!
Letang or Carlson, oh, what a great job by Dowd. He just whacks it forward.
Ovechkin looks for Dowd on the toe drag. Dowd fires, he scores! Time of the tally, Jensen cranks it up, deflection, score! Dowd does it again!
Would set the tone. Here's a chance. They score! Nic Dowd! Now Nic Dowd for Washington. Dowd around Crevier and a big save by...
Now up the middle. Here's Dowd. He scores! Nic Dowd!
Since the statistics' inception, more and more full-time players are having overwhelmingly defensive deployments, suggesting that coaches are more often deploying to players' strengths or their weaknesses. Think about it. What do those teams with the most defensive lines all have in common? They have lines with offensive dynamo superstars, all of whom almost never start in the D-zone 5-on-5. Fun fact, Artemi Panarin has 3 of the top 4 offensive zone start percentage seasons of all time, out of 3,427. The only team with these lines that doesn't have a guy solidly in the top 50 is Dallas, but they're cool. It stands to reason that a coach plays his most offensively gifted players in the offensive zone, but more and more recently we're seeing specific designated players take up the slack of that average themselves, as opposed to more evenly distributing it across the remaining 3 lines. The offensive guys get offenser and the defensive guys get defenser. But in Nic Dowd's case, it's not just maximizing on his skill. For the Capitals, he might just be playing a pivotal role in hockey history, because every time Nic Dowd or Nick Aube-Kubel or Beck Malenstein can eat a shift backed up against their own goalie, Alex Ovechkin can take one staring down the opponents. And despite being 38, At just 41 goals away from breaking the all-time goal record, Nic Dowd is giving him all the help he can. A very special thank you to all of my patrons, especially Amazing Kook 143, Eric Sheldon, Ethan Johnson, Infernos Gaming, Pylon Zin, Sky Shiver, Steely Dan 32, and Stuckmund.